Our panel today includes Senator Costa, who he's the Senate Democratic leader. He's been in the Senate for the state Senate for a good long time and is very knowledgeable about both what's happening in the Senate and what's happening around the state related to voting suppression and voting access. So we're going to ask him to talk about that in a second. Could you talk for a minute about what's going on the state level, especially in the legislature, with regard to legislation, both on the efforts to suppress votes and also on the efforts to protect voting? What's out there? How's it look in terms of the likelihood of passage and enactment?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate, and thank you for the wonderful video for Congressman Doyle. It was great to reminisce through those photographs, and just been an outstanding member of Congress and representing our community. Mike talked a lot about some of the things that are going on around the country, and I can tell you that Pennsylvania is no different. There are a number of measures that have been advancing both in the legislature, but also in the courts as well, that have been designed to do one thing: undermine our democracy and to continue to cast doubt on what occurred in 2020 as part of the big lie, and then the steps that they've taken since then to be able to perpetuate that notion with the public. And as I mentioned, have folks have a level of distrust about our process, specifically as it relates to Act 77. After Act 77 passed a couple of years back with just about unanimous Republican support, 11 Republican members of the House and a few other citizens went to Commonwealth Court and were able to get Judge McCullough, former Allegheny County judge, common pleas judge now, who was the only judge in the case that Michael talked about, the only case that resulted in a victory, so to speak, for Donald Trump during 2020. Nevertheless, that Act 77, she, along with two other Republican judges, ruled that Act 77 was unconstitutional. So that's the one path that they're going through. That Act 77, as you know, is our mail-in balloting. They've been consistently trying to make a case and have had hearings over the course of the past 18 months across Pennsylvania, articulating that it's a flawed process that lacks security, things of that nature. Commonwealth Court ended up ruling that way. It's now before the Supreme Court. Our hope is sooner than later that the Supreme Court would overturn that Commonwealth Court decision. Right now, they're still in effect. There was a stay. There's an automatic stay on that particular type of a case because of the nature of that case. So the outcome of that case will not be impacting until the court makes a decision. However, Republicans have gone in again trying to get rid of that stay so that we will not have mail-in ballots for this primary election. I do not believe Commonwealth Court will likely move the stay out of the way, but the court, I think, will ultimately keep it in place as we go forward. So that matter won't be resolved. I believe that the hearings are scheduled to be sometime in March. So that's the court path with Act 77, but there's a legislative path as well. There's a constitutional path. There are a number of things that they're trying to do in the legislature to undermine the right to vote. Certainly Act 77 is one of them. For years, the last 3 years, we've been trying to do things since Act 77 went into place with regard to a couple things that we felt were important in the process to give folks faith that their votes were important, their votes counted, and their votes were secure. One of them was to make sure that we had an efficient count of the votes, something called pre-canvassing. Right now, the earliest we can count those mail-in ballots is this election morning at 8 a.m. And that's one of the reasons why you've seen across Pennsylvania in many small counties, the vote totals through mail-in balloting would come in late. The next day, sometimes we would not have final results. We've been trying to move it up 3 days, 4 days, or 5 days to begin that process to allow for those votes to be counted more quickly. Republicans have refused to do that. Of the 67 counties, the county election officials and directors and commissioners all agree that that is their number one priority with respect to election law, advancing that measure. The second measure is having uniformity and consistency around drop boxes. We believe that needs to be done to be able to set an appropriate standard across Pennsylvania. Republicans don't want to make it easier for folks to vote. Obviously, they don't want to do mail-in balloting, nor do they want to be able to pass legislation to authorize or even put standards in place with regard to those drop boxes that we know of. That's the second thing that they're trying to do. with respect to, even though we have Act 77 in place, they've tried to undermine the changes that took place previously as part of Act 77. For example, as related to when we can go and voter registration. Right now, we are 2 weeks before the election. They want to go back, I believe, to 28 days. So that you'd wait, if you don't register within a month before the election or 28 days before the election, you can't get registered. One of the things that we've been attempting to do is to try to do same day registration is one of the things that we're working on. And I think that's an important step going forward. The timing when the ballots go out, they're trying to limit the time the ballots go out to make it more difficult for people to apply for a mail-in ballot, but then also not have enough turnaround time for the ballot to be received by the election department sending it out and then having it come back by 8 p.m. on Tuesday. They've made attempts to be able to change that law as well. These are all in the works in various measures. Probably the one that's gotten a lot of attention is the issue with respect to what we call, voter intimidation. Right now, you have to be in the county that you reside in to be a poll watcher, so to speak, and someone who can work the polls along those lines. They want to allow folks from anywhere. First of all, they wanted to do it. Anyone from around the country can come in to be able to come in and work and use voter intimidation along those lines. Now it's been down. They want to do anyone in the state. So somebody from McKean County can come into the city of Pittsburgh and monitor elections. We don't think that's appropriate because what ends up happening is, was mentioned to Michael, they slow the process down. They question people's ability to vote, saying they don't have the right credentials or they shouldn't be presented for voting, et cetera. That's another matter that they're working to be able to do. We, after 2020's election, we put into place what was called the Election Law Advisory Board. That came out of Act 12 back in 2020, which changed the election date because we needed to do it for COVID-19. The Election Law Advisory Committee, as I mentioned, was about 40 or so election officials, as well as county commissioners and members of the legislature, who all came together and for about 9 months studied the outcome of the 2020 election and gave a report to the legislature. Democrat and Republican said the election was safe, it was secure, and the things that we needed to do were pre-canvassing, as I mentioned, drop box security, and a few other minor things. And most importantly, additional resources, which we did with Act 77, additional resources to our counties to have the appropriate technology to be able to handle the voter identification the mail-in ballots. But the other thing that they've been consistently trying to do and pass really onerous legislation, even legislation worse than what Mike Turzai did that Mike talked about, that was stricken by a Commonwealth Court a number of years ago. They passed the voter ID law that would have made it more difficult for folks of color, minority communities, our elderly folks, the ability to vote. It passed both chambers. All Democrats voted against it, and Governor Wolf vetoed it. They're now trying to go through the constitutional process to try to do the same thing. By the way, as well as what they're doing with about a half dozen or eight or so different ways in which they're trying to get around the governor's veto with constitutional amendments, which they're trying to legislate through the Constitution, basically. But voter identification is probably the major issue that we're dealing with right now. And they will not discuss the issues regarding pre-canvassing or drop box security or additional technology or resource for technology and moving the same-day voter registration. All those things are tied up unless they get voter identification. And there's no real compromise that I can see that's in sight along those lines. We had an arrangement back in October 2020 to address 3 or 4 of these issues. But every time we sit down, we reach an agreement among the 4 caucuses and the governor, and then House Republicans primarily would raise the bar to a point where it never got done. So those are all the things that are being done. But beyond that, to further perpetuate this big lie theory, they are doing a number of things in the space of auditing. We're doing a major audit right now of the election outcome from 2020. The Republican-controlled Intergovernmental Affairs Committee issued subpoenas asking for over 9 million voting records of people of Pennsylvania to be able to see what the issues were and to try to find errors or things of that nature. Without any level of security, what happens with these ballots? These will be their ballots. It'll be their their driver's license number. It'll be the last 4 digits of their social security number. They continue to do this. Just last week, they've already spent about $300,000 in this process. Just last week, they spent another $185,000 to expand the scope of this search to include a county, Fulton County, which with 85 or 87% for Donald Trump. The county commissioner came in and testified before a hearing and said that there were no problems in our county. Nevertheless, they want to do an audit of that county. These are the same folks who are participated and have participated in the Arizona audit that we know what the outcome of that was. It was a favorable audit for President Biden. So these are just an example of the things that they are doing on a regular basis in our legislature. They put together a special integrity committee. Again, a special integrity committee that I picked 4 folks, they picked 4 folks. They went out and had a hearing in the Senate over the course of last year. That committee came back about 6-7 months ago and came back and said it was safe, it was a secure election, and that there was really no fraud that took place. But despite that, they're ignoring that and continuing to go down this path. Now, I would tell you that this whole process is being led by a couple of people in the Senate. Senator Doug Mastriano, Senator Chris Dush, or the 2 principals, Senator Judy Ward, who have been at the forefront of working with Arizona. In fact, a year ago, they went to Arizona to find out what they did to come back to Pennsylvania and implement the same plan. They're doing that. The reason I tell you about Doug Mastriano, because he's the leading candidate for governor of the Republican Party. He's up front and he's likely to win the Republican nomination. That gives you an example. He's the guy, along with Rick Saccone, that on January 6th were a part of the insurrection that took place there. And while he claims that he left and walked off the property and left the area, there's video evidence of him walking on the grounds of the Capitol building. These are the type of things that we have up against. These folks are geared towards undermining our democracy as we know it. It's frightening and it's getting worse every day. So those are just some of the things that are going on. And I haven't even talked about the whole gerrymandering conversation, which I'm happy to do that as well. I know I've rambled on quite a bit, but all these things are in the works. Greater, difficult voter ID, making it difficult to vote. If we're going to do mail-in ballots, far more restrictions about verifying who's voting, who's signing the ballots, et cetera, are all in the works. They're trying to pass. And I will tell you, some of them will pass the General Assembly. Unfortunately, we have a Democratic governor, Tom Wolf, who's been able to stand up and veto these things. We stood behind him and stood up in those vetoes. That's why it's imperative that we really work to get a Democratic governor to stay there, because otherwise in Pennsylvania, we won't be any different than some of these other states that you've heard about. So I rambled on quite a bit. I apologize. It just gets frustrating to all these different things going on with these guys. It makes it difficult to pay attention to the important issues we need to talk about.